Let's start today with inflation. Now, I want to approach this from an economic perspective because I've been getting dozens of emails from people wanting an explanation about how inflation eventually goes away. And I've touched on this a little bit, but let's talk about it in more detail. Now, when I say I don't want to make this a political story, there are some political statements I have to make because there is so much political misinformation around inflation. There's been inflation, high inflation all over the world. Some countries with higher inflation than the United States, some countries with lower inflation than the United States. There are many in the US who want to blame Joe Biden for inflation. I have found no evidence that Joe Biden is to blame. And in fact, the US is not at the highest or at the lowest level of inflation over the last year. This is a global phenomenon related to a lot of different things that we've talked about. And for those pointing specifically to Joe Biden's COVID relief package as the reason for the inflation, remember that Donald Trump did two such packages and they were bigger than Joe Biden. So if that's why you blame Biden, you have to blame Trump at least two times as much. And none of these people are. So like with the political stuff out of the way, there's lots of confusion about like, how does inflation eventually go away? And one of the realities about inflation is that sustained inflation will eventually reduce inflation. And I'm going to explain to you how that works. But when people talk about markets and cycles, this is actually what we mean. One of the best, there are many examples of markets that don't work or are kind of pie in the sky fantasy. They don't relate to how the real world works. When it comes to inflation, ultimately resolving inflation, it actually does work this way. So to start this, let's talk about what is a good level of inflation or deflation or no price changes. Like what would we want? Well, a really high level of inflation is bad because people very quickly can't afford things. It's bad for the economy because things get so expensive that others don't buy anything. So it's bad for business. It makes it so that people's wages no longer can keep up with the cost of living. So really high inflation is bad. And we're seeing high inflation, at least by American historical standards right now. It might seem like, well, then is deflation good? Because if prices go down, people can afford stuff. No, deflation is also bad. And again, the framework here is the framework is the traditional understanding of how modern economies work. You could say, David, sir, the entire framework is crap. Put it in the trash. And that's a different discussion. But at least in the modern economic framework, deflation is bad because if you expect things to get cheaper in the future, you would wait to buy them. I mean, okay, things you absolutely need. You're not going to say, well, I won't eat for a month because food will be cheaper in a month. No, then you're dead. You need food. But with a ton of different purchases, if you expect prices to be lower in the future because we are in the middle of a deflationary situation, you would say, I'm going to wait to buy stuff. And when you don't buy, businesses don't have money coming in, meaning they have to lay off workers. And now those workers don't have money to buy things because they've been laid off. So that's a deflationary spiral. That's also bad. So in traditional economics, the understanding is you want a little bit of inflation. A little bit of inflation is where economic growth comes from. A little bit of inflation is the reason why you're not going to go hoarding supplies, but you would purchase things. If I want to look at a car and the car is affordable today, the car is 10 grand and I can afford 10 grand. If I expect the car will be 8 grand next year, I wait, I don't buy it. If the car is already unaffordable, I don't buy it. But if the car is 10 grand today and I expect it to be $10,500 in a year, that's a pretty good reason to go and buy the car today. So I'm now supporting the dealership. I'm supporting the manufacturer. Okay, so that's the framework for why we say a little bit of inflation is good. Let's talk about then what happens when there is inflation. Inflation initially creates more inflation. People fear, wow, prices are going up. They might go even higher. I've got to go and buy stuff now before I can no longer afford it. That increases inflation even more. And things start to cost more for workers. So the workers demand more wages, and to cover the increased wages, the employers start charging more for the products, and you have an inflationary cycle. This only works in the short term because you can only pre-purchase so much stuff. You can only get ahead before prices go up so long. Eventually, inflation is going to reduce the purchasing power for people. People aren't going to be able to buy as much stuff. A great example is like with a house. If you've got a down payment saved up and you can afford $1,000 a month mortgage, at a 3% mortgage, maybe your house that you can afford is 200 grand. When mortgage rates go up, as we see inflation, you can no longer afford a $200,000 house, because to keep your payment at $1,000 because of the higher rate, now you can only afford a $180,000 house. This then puts pressure on the home seller to decrease the price. So eventually, inflation, which takes away purchasing power, starts to make a downward pressure on prices. And that ultimately is what reduces the inflation. Now, obviously, there's problems with doing nothing, because in the short and medium term, while this is going on, people start to be unable to afford things that they need. Poor people are hurt the most by this inflationary cycle. So you've got to figure out, how do we deal with that? And there's a whole bunch that's beyond the scope of this segment, but there's a whole bunch of things that governments can do to say, well, let's figure out how to support folks who can't afford certain necessities during this period of time. High inflation can hurt business innovation because it starts to get more expensive to start a business. Someone might say, I'm not going to start the business. Well, it's a business that could have employed people. It's a business that could have manufactured a product or provided a service. So that's not good for the economy either. And you've got to figure out how to deal with that. None of this is to pretend that anything is any worse or better than it actually is. It's to gain an understanding of how longer term inflation will reduce inflation. In the meantime, we have to take very seriously the effect that it has on people, the effect that it has on the economy. But for people who say, well, what, can't Joe Biden just like sign something and fix this issue? In an economy the size of the economy of the United States, no, the answer is no. And the mechanism that will ultimately reduce that inflation to some degree is inflation itself. Let me know if that's clear or if it's not clear. The only subscription streaming service dedicated to documentaries is CuriosityStream, one of our sponsors. If you love documentaries like me, you should really check out CuriosityStream. They've got all the newest and best documentary titles, tons of stuff I can't find on Netflix or Hulu. And CuriosityStream is only $125 a month when you use my link below. If you're looking for those new award-winning documentaries, they've got them. If you're looking for the classics from years ago, they have those as well. I just watched a fantastic documentary called Deep Time History, which goes into early, like prehistory. Fascinating. And CuriosityStream has an app for all of your devices, TV, phone, computer. Whether you want to watch a serene nature documentary on the couch or check out a juicy political corruption story, CuriosityStream has you covered. You can get CuriosityStream for $15 a year. That's $1.25 a month, only when you go to curiositystream.com/Pacman and use the code Pacman. The link is down below.